Hi there, I'm Michael Tomasky. I'm the American editor of The Guardian in Washington, D.C.
And I'm Rich Lowry, editor of National Review magazine here in New York City.
Okay. Hi, Rich. We're going to get started. We're going to start with talking about what I think is going to be the most important issue in this campaign between John McCain and Barack Obama, this question of national security and terrorism. We're in day 2 now, maybe day 3 of, I think, the first set piece of this campaign on this issue, stemming from the Supreme Court decision from last week. Obama supported it, McCain opposed it. Here's what I basically think, Rich. I think that this is an issue that McCain is going to win. In the polls on November 4th, November 5th, whatever happens in the election, they're going to say, who did you trust more on national security? I think McCain will probably be ahead in that poll. Doesn't necessarily mean he's going to win the election, because I think there are 2 other important questions. Number 1, can Obama sufficiently make the election about other things, the economy and health care and so on and so forth, the issues that favor him more than favor Obama? And the second question, I think to me the more important and the more intellectually interesting one, can Obama hold his own on these kinds of issues in a way that John Kerry could not in 2004? I'll say that I think, based on the evidence so far, yes, I think Obama is going to be able to hold his own on these issues, not lose a whole lot of ground on this question. I think his return of fire over the last couple of days has been pretty impressive. He stood his ground, and I think that it's an encouraging thing for Obama supporters to see.
Well, Mike, I was struck as well by that Washington Post poll, where it just makes clear what an astonishingly poor issue environment this election is for Republicans. Every single domestic issue, Barack Obama leads, not just narrowly, by huge margins, by 20 points on most things. The only thing where McCain is competitive or ahead is the Iraq War, where he leads by a grand total of 1 point, foreign policy, where he leads by about 4 points, and then terrorism, the strongest issue, where he leads by 14 points. So he's going to try to steer the discussion to national security and terrorism, obviously, as much as possible, and this Gitmo decision was a big opening to do that. And I don't think by any means John McCain will or can win the election on national security. I think its importance is it plays that threshold question with Barack Obama. Is he ready and prepared to be president and to be commander-in-chief? That's the key question that national security plays into, because if you look at the right track, wrong track numbers, 84% of people think the country's on the wrong track. If you look at Obama and McCain, and which is associated with change, Obama has a 34-point lead there. So you just look at those 2 numbers, and that's a lot of the election to me, right there.
Yeah.
And the only thing that's going to stop, given all that, Obama from winning, is if people at the end of the day look at him and say, yeah, he represents change, but he's not quite ready. He doesn't meet that test.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's going to be a question, probably the question about Obama. I'll tell you what I think about the last couple of days. Now, I was an opponent of the Iraq War. You were a supporter of the war. I think when somebody like Randy Schoenman says that Obama's being delusional, I think it's quite easy for Obama and his surrogates and his supporters to come back and say, who was the delusional party here? And Woolsey, who argued, right after September 11th in the New Republic that it might have been Osama bin Laden who attacked us, but chances are better.
You mean Saddam Hussein?
No, he said it might have been Osama bin Laden. Chances are it was Saddam Hussein, or Saddam Hussein was centrally involved. So if I were the candidate and I had Woolsey and Randy Schoenman calling me delusional, I think I'd know what to do with that.
Well, when you said delusional, you had to characterize it as delusional party. And that's because John McCain did not partake of the delusions that unfortunately characterized a lot of supporters of the war, 05, 06 period, even, National Review at times, unfortunately. McCain was clear-eyed about this and had the judgment to realize we needed a new strategy in Iraq. And he's done more than anyone else besides President Bush and General Petraeus and Odierno to put this war back on the right track and make it what could be a severe defeat for al-Qaeda, and what it's looking like to be a severe defeat for al-Qaeda. So when you go to the judgment issue on national security, This was a key question whether to do the surge or not, and Barack Obama was dead wrong on it. And Obama's plan, if he took it seriously, to get our combat troops out by March 08 would have handed a huge victory to al-Qaeda in Iraq. So I don't think by any means this is a slam dunk by Barack Obama, and I don't see him really saying or developing any arguments any different from John Kerry when John Kerry lost the national security debate in 2004.
Well, I think there's one argument he can make very differently, which is that he opposed the war from the start. And you know, large majorities still think that the war was a bad idea and wasn't worth fighting. But I want to also ask you something else that's been on my mind for the last couple of days as I've watched this debate unfold. Now, excuse me, McCain and his surrogates, like Schoeneman and John Lehman and so forth, and Giuliani have pounced on Obama and said basically that he wants to arrest terrorists and try them and, you know, read them their Miranda rights and make sure that they have, you know, cushions in prison and all this kind of stuff. But it is also true, and wouldn't you acknowledge, I mean, you have to acknowledge this, right? In his...
Don't be so sure, Mike, whatever it is.
In his speech in August of 2007, he said that he would go take out Osama bin Laden in Pakistan. So he didn't say, I'm going to arrest Osama bin Laden and make sure he has a pillow for his head in his prison cell. He said, I'll go kill the guy. So McCain's campaign is not being fair here. Isn't that true?
Well, look, I think where I come out on this whole question of enemy combatants stems from the fact that these are people that you're going to go and drop a bomb on their head. Which to me speaks to the fact that they are enemy combatants. They're not common domestic criminals. And the problem I have with the Gitmo decision and with what a lot of liberals say on this is they conflate the two. And they want to head in the direction of giving these guys all the rights and privileges of someone in the United States caught up in our criminal system. Well, we don't, bomb muggers, on the streets of New York City. That's because they're not enemy combatants. It's entirely a different category. So I think it's legitimate for the McCain people to hit Obama on his support for this decision.
Well, it's legitimate to do that. I don't question that. And at least according to yesterday's Washington Post ABC poll that we've been mentioning, people are on McCain's side on this question. So I don't think Obama stands to gain a lot politically. I admire what he has to. I admire that he's taking a position that's unpopular, and I don't think it's I understand your point, what you just said about the distinction between street criminals and enemy combatant, real enemy combatants. But, it's not like the Obama position is a position that only he and Noam Chomsky are taking. I mean, George Will took essentially Obama's position yesterday in the Washington Post.
Yeah, well, George, one, is a huge supporter of congressional power and has been very skeptical all along of assertions of the executive power by the Bush administration,
right,
and has been alienated on the national security stuff by the Iraq War, although I wouldn't characterize that column. I'd have to go back and read it, but I would say it was wishy-washy on the decision rather than frankly supportive of it.
Yeah, I guess that's true, but it was pretty critical of McCain's own flip-flops, and that brings me to another aspect of this, which I think even if McCain wins the national security fistfight straight up, I think that now it's also a flip-flop issue for McCain, right?
Yeah.
Because, I'll close Gitmo my first day in the White House.
Yeah.
And now,
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. McCain has switched on a lot of stuff now. It'll be interesting to see whether that kind of flip-flop narrative takes hold, because we all know, and politics is often unfair. You can change your positions as much as the other guy, but if the other guy somehow gets that narrative in place that he's a flip-flopper, well, then every one of his changes in positions matters in a way that yours don't. And Democrats are trying to push that flip-flop narrative on McCain. I don't think the flip-flop thing works so much, just because that's not symbolically where he's ever been. I think the pandering to the right wing and being McSame and being another iteration of the Bush administration, I think that's the more fruitful avenue. But you hit on a really key thing here, which there was a deep ambivalence in the McCain campaign's reaction to this decision, which it shouldn't be I mean, you can be outraged on procedural grounds. It's not the role of the Supreme Court to be tearing up these procedures and well, they haven't even written them anew because it's so vague what they want. But on the substance, McCain opposes Gitmo. So his initial reaction to the decision was, well, it concerns me, but we need to move ahead. And then it took a day or two after, I imagine, a lot of internal wrangling in the campaign for McCain to come out and call
you guys too.
Sure, and to come out and call it the worst decision ever, or whatever it was, which was the line that George Will was reacting against.
Yeah, well, that was a little over the top line. Dred Scott, et cetera, et cetera. I think, that looked to me like, he got a lot of phone calls in those 24 hours from the day that he expressed mere concern.
But, Mike, while we're talking about changes in McCain positions, we had another one, at least certainly a change in emphasis with his big energy speech down in Houston, where he came out in favor of offshore drilling. He's getting hammered now from environmentalists and from Democrats, saying this is another case of John McCain pandering to the right wing. And this is another issue where the National Review and others on the right, the Wall Street Journal and others, were really very critical of where John McCain was on this issue, because politically, you have gas at $4 a gallon. To me, it just seems a no-brainer for Republicans to do everything they can to position themselves as the party of cheap and abundant energy. We'll do anything we can to increase the supply of energy in this country, including drilling, in environmentally safe ways. The technology is better. It's not a risk to anyone. The only thing is kind of aesthetic considerations, and those shouldn't trump drilling and exploiting our own resources at a time when Congress is banging the table, threatening to sue OPEC for not pumping more. Well, we have plenty of more pumping we could do in this country.
Yeah. Well, I do think I do think it's a pretty good issue for McCain. First of all, substantively, as you and I both know, if they approved offshore drilling tomorrow, it's going to be several years before they get an ounce of oil out of those offshore wells. So, it's not going to have anything to do with what gas costs now or in 2011 or 2012, really. However, I think politically it is probably a pretty good issue for McCain. And the line that you just articulated, we're trying to do something about this cheap energy, and the Democrats won't let us do it because they need to protect some weird species of fish, in the Gulf or whatever it is probably a pretty compelling line, and I think the Obama team has to have a little bit better answer to it than they had yesterday, which was kind of basically an environmental answer. I think, this is a situation where, Obama is in a position of having to connect dots. I mean, I think he punched back really well on the national security stuff. On the energy issue, he's in a position of having to explain, well, it's not that simple. And when you're explaining that it's not that simple, you lose a certain amount of people. So, I think that, my sense from things I read is that offshore drilling is still is more unpopular than not in Florida. So it's not a total winner for McCain, but I would concede at least that he was playing offense on this one yesterday.
Yeah, well, I take your point. Obviously, it's not going to do anything substantial. It might have a little downward pressure on the futures markets, but it's not going to do anything substantial about the price of oil. But it's just a very intuitive case. If you have supply and demand out of whack because there's more demand and not enough supply, let's do everything we can to increase supply. It's a very intuitive, simple case to make. And I just wonder lately whether we're beginning to see a real pricking in what I consider the global warming bubble. Because if Barack Obama, and I give him credit, he's been somewhat forthright about this, but if he was going to be really forthright, he'd say, look, it's great that the price of gas is so high. Let's have it go higher because fossil fuels are a threat, a dangerous threat to our planet. And I think the politics of that would be terrible. I think on the substance, it's terrible, whereas global warming is real and there's a man-made component about that. I consider, I just concede that up top. We're talking about, if it's a real danger, we're talking a threat, that might be a threat, that might happen 100 years or more from now, and primarily is going to affect, the coastal areas of Bangladesh and other countries like that. It'd be a wash here in the United States. Now, I think we should be undertaking research, to try to develop new technologies that minimize our carbon emissions. I'd be for trying to hold Bangladesh harmless if all these terrible scenarios come true by sharing technology or aid or whatever it is with them. But this is a case where I think Democrats are offering something that's really an abstraction. They're talking about fighting a threat that's an abstraction in a way that really would harm the pocketbook interests of Americans here in the here and now.
Hillary Clinton used to say, I think I read her saying this a couple of times, that as she was giving her stump speech and going through the usual, crises and awful things that were happening in the world and noticing what was an applause line and what was not an applause line, she said that when she tried to talk about climate change, that never really revved people up very much, and it wasn't a very big applause line. It might have had something to do with the way she said it. Maybe she didn't feel that passionately about it and didn't invest it with the proper brio or something, but I do think that it is a little abstract to a lot of people, and $4 a gallon gasoline is not abstract. But look, I think Obama, he clearly has a big passion about global warming and climate change as an issue. I think it's going to be a challenge for him to communicate that to people, and but he also has he has an interesting mix of views about energy, because he went to Detroit and he gave that speech and said that you're going to have to make smaller cars, basically, which they're going to do now. I don't think there's any question that the age of the SUV is coming to an end. He represents, remember, a coal-producing state. So as far as the green folks are concerned, he's not been very good on coal questions, and he's trying to. He's trying to talk up this clean coal technology, which a lot of people think is a bunch of nonsense. But he does have a very aggressive cap and trade system in place. It'll be a really fascinating thing to see if cap and trade becomes one of these phrases out of this campaign. You know how there's always some phrases that people actually get to know? It'll be really interesting if people get to know what cap and trade means, which apparently John McCain doesn't quite.
Well, and also, a lot of advocates who don't seem to know what it means. It's such a complicated scheme. But let me ask you, while we're still on energy, one thing, Mike. Speaking of bubbles, there's a real bubble on the right in favor of nuclear energy. It's something McCain is talking about a lot. For us, it seems to make a lot of sense. It's an alternate energy that we know that works right now. It's not like wind, solar, and tide that are quite theoretical in terms of producing massive amounts of energy at this moment. What are we on the right missing about nuclear energy, if anything?
I don't think that much. I could name you people who would come on here and argue with you about it, but I'm not one of them. I think that nuclear energy is worth looking at. I'm hardly an expert on it, but I've done some looking into the question of how the technology has changed in the last 30 years. There's obviously still a strong emotional reaction to 3 Mile Island and what to do with the waste and so on and so forth. But energy is one of those things where I do think that neither side really completely levels with us very much. We're going to need coal. There's centuries worth of coal in the hills of my home state of West Virginia and throughout the United States. We're going to need to keep mining coal. There's nothing we can really do about that. It lights half of our lights. It provides for half of our electricity. I think that nuclear has changed a lot, as I said, in the last 30 years, and is worth exploring. I'm all for putting as many investments as we can in renewables and clean technologies. And I think that this is going to sound crazy to some people, I guess, but I think that fuel cell technologies for cars doesn't necessarily have to be that far away, and that would really change many things in this world. So I think that's worth investing a lot of money in. But yeah, I'm not too far away from you on nuclear power, and I think that Obama has not really slammed the door on it either, if I'm not mistaken.
Mike, this is more substance than I can take, so we got to get to the horse race.
I agree,
and the polls. start us off on what you think of the question of whether Obama has had a bounce, how much of a bounce, has it been disappointing or not?
Well, he's had just a small bounce from being the nominee. I didn't think that he was going to get a huge bounce because there's that portion of the Democratic Party that was against him. Some of those people still aren't sold on him. And that's going to take a while. So I didn't think that was something that was just going to happen overnight, and he was going to be able to, pick up 8 points from Hillary Clinton's white working class voters. So it's not something I don't think for his people to be that concerned about. We see 3 polls today, 3 state polls from one polling firm, from Quinnipiac, that shows him with really substantial lead, surprisingly substantial lead in Pennsylvania, if the polls to be believed, 12 points, leading also in Ohio and Florida. I think that Obama needs to be ahead in the polls by 5, 6, 7 points for his people to feel at all comfortable, because there may be this Bradley effect thing, or there may be a sense that some people, not that they're lying to pollsters. I don't think that may not be so much the case as it was back in the 1970s or 80s, but I think there will be this phenomenon too. A number of white voters, and I wouldn't necessarily call them racist voters. They're not your stereotypically racist voters. I don't think, they probably know some black people and have some black coworkers and friends and so on and so forth. It may just be the case that the idea of voting for a black man for president of the United States is something that they just have to sort of wrap their heads around, and it'll take them some time to decide that that's what they're going to do. So that's a risk for Obama, and that's why I think he needs this 5 to 7 point cushion that he has now.
Yeah, I think he needs more than that. I really think if projecting forward, if after the Democratic convention he's not, if his lead is 12 points or less, I think it's going to be a very, very close race, because I buy what I think is basically the conventional wisdom that we're probably looking at a race that's a lot like 1976, where you have a poisonous electoral environment for the incumbent party. You have a challenger who's come out of nowhere, who's a fresh face, who represents change. And Jimmy Carter in that race, I believe, was ahead by 33 points at one point, and ended up winning by 2. And I think a lot of that is just like, okay, this guy represents change, what I was talking about at the beginning of our segment here, but is he really up for the job? And let's think about this more seriously. So I think even if Obama has a lead into the double digits, a lot of it is going to be inevitably eroded away in the fall, and it's going to be really close. So in some of these initial polls that came out after Obama had wrapped up the nomination, where he was only ahead by the Gallup tracking poll at times by 2 or 4 points, I was astonished by that, and as someone who wants McCain to win, quite happy. Now, of course, the Quinnipiac battleground polls that you mentioned have begun to change the conventional wisdom on how much of a bounce Obama has gotten, because being up in Florida is something we haven't seen. Having that kind of lead in Ohio is very notable, and not even having it close in Pennsylvania is very notable. And if Obama can win Ohio, of course, I mean it's ball game over. And I think a lot of Republicans also had already put Florida in McCain's back pocket. So it'll be interesting and distressing for Republicans if it's more competitive than that. And we still haven't seen how the offshore drilling stuff will play down there.
I think Florida's way up for grabs. I really do. I think a few things. Number one, the Jewish vote, yes, it's going to be a challenge for Obama, but, he's going to win it. Well, the question is whether he's going to win it by 55 or 75. So that's going to be a fight for him, but it's a fight that he can make by spending time there. The Latino vote. You notice I said Latino, not Cuban, because in Florida now, as of this year, the Latino vote is less than 50% Cuban American, and it's more other, Central American, South American, Mexican, what have you. Those groups, as you know, are more democratic, much more democratic than Cuban Americans, A. B, younger Cuban Americans are much more liberal and much less conservative in the old-fashioned anti-communist way than their parents and grandparents are. And I think that Obama's decision to go down and speak to the Cuban American National Foundation and Moscanosa's son a few Fridays ago may prove to be a pivotal and important moment, and as timely and intelligent a speech as he's given. It was a really good speech, and it was really important that he went down there. I think he can hold his own among Florida Latinos and even among the younger Cuban American voters. So I think for those mainly for those two reasons, I think Florida's way in play. And I also I don't know. I don't think he's got to be 12 points ahead. I don't see many parallels, frankly, with Jimmy Carter. I think this is a much better run campaign than Jimmy Carter's campaign was. And I think, after all, these guys beat the Clintons. He beat Hillary Clinton. They know what they're doing. They seem to know how to do certain things. Now, back to polls, and I'll tie these two things together. I think that there is also a chance that polls may be undersampling what the ultimate black vote is going to be. And the black vote, the black turnout may be, what, Rich, 65% in a lot of states? I think it's going to be really high. And I think their get-out-the-vote operation, something tells me, if, past practice is indication, I think it's going to be a very impressive get-out-the-vote operation. And they're going to find just about every Obama voter in the state of, Virginia and Florida and Ohio who exists and make sure they get to the polls.
I see a lot of parallels between Obama and Carter, actually. We tend to forget it now. Certainly conservatives do, but Carter was an incredibly charismatic figure who, was a big underdog. He didn't face the kind of establishment juggernaut that Obama did this time around. He was excellent on TV, had this million-watt smile, and also, like Obama, had this really messianic, self-righteous streak where there is kind of airy rhetoric about everything being made anew in our politics. So I think there are a lot of similarities there. But on the other hand, I do give Obama this. He out-organized Hillary Clinton. He out-fundraised Hillary Clinton. He outspun Hillary Clinton and basically outclassed Hillary Clinton. And those are not minor things whatsoever. And in my mind, constitute one of Obama's strongest arguments when it comes to that question. Well, what have you ever run? You've never been an executive. You've come from nowhere, on the national scene, just 4 years. What qualifies you to be president of the United States? How do we know you'll do a good job? Well, the thing that he's run is his campaign.
Yeah.
And he's done it extremely deftly and impressively. And if you're just, I hate to say it, going to line up Obama and McCain and make their campaigns the test for their executive abilities, Obama wins that contest, I think, pretty easily, given that the biggest organization McCain had to run was that campaign in 2007 that he blew up, and then he won the Republican race basically being a one-man band with a few loyalists around him. And then I don't think, so since winning the nomination, he's knocked anyone out with his organizational ability either.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm just curious. I just want to ask you a question because I don't really know, the ins and outs of the McCain campaign, but I do know something about the ins and outs of the Obama campaign, as I think we all do, because they've gotten a lot of publicity. And we understand. It seems like it's just a really well run and really well put together, and organization that's looking far down the road and that's seeing around corners and that is knowing how to handle things, doesn't make many mistakes, so on and so forth. Does McCain have a good flow chart? Does he have a good organization in place?
I don't get the impression that he does. I think he's been going on since his front-running campaign collapsed. He basically said, well, I'm going to trust my gut instinct. And he won the nomination based on his gut instinct.
Right.
And, I'm kind of going to do my own thing. And I think it's been a very rough transition from that mindset to running a national campaign, which you has to do here. And there's been a lot of frustration with on the right that it hasn't been well organized machine by any means. And I think he relies a lot on the guys that were with him through thick and thin. Mark Salter, who could be his right hand, is such a talented, incredibly talented writer. Steve Schmidt, who's the spokesman, very tough and shrewd guy, and we all know him from 2004 when every other sentence out of his mouth was, John Kerry voted for the funding before he voted against it, relentlessly pushing that message. But I think that, that's kind of, and there's Rick Davis who's back at headquarters, but that's kind of the circle.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, and it's a pretty good segue into issue 4, which is basically, which of these candidates has bigger problems in his own party? Now, I'll toss it to you by just, again, citing for maybe the last time that Washington Post ABC poll yesterday. Plethora of interesting information in that thing. And the question that...
It's just that we don't read any other polls besides the Washington Post, to be honest.
Not, yeah, but the question that stood out to me with that pertains to what we're talking about here is they asked him, like, how enthusiastic are you about your candidate? And I don't remember the numbers offhand except to say that in the category of very enthusiastic about their candidate, the Obama number was close to 50 or maybe just above
like 53 or something like that.
Yeah, and the McCain number was 9%.
Yeah.
And I thought, ooh, and that almost made me feel bad for the guy reading that 9%.
Yeah, I think that's probably a pretty accurate read. But, on the other hand, a number that jumped out at me with regard to party unity, that Washington Post poll still had, I believe, about 25% of Hillary supporters still saying that they weren't supporting Obama, which was what we heard in a lot of the exit polls, in which I thought would pretty quickly that number would go down, but it's still there. I don't know whether that's what that's a function of, whether that's a function of the demographic, makeup a lot of those Hillary supporters or what. But McCain has about pretty solid support among Republicans. It's just not very enthusiastic, and he's kind of on a knife's edge when it comes to that enthusiasm gap, because anything he does wrong, and any candidate's going to do some things wrong, but anything he does wrong, you just have conservatives just getting this pit of despair feeling in their stomach, even over little stuff, that Tuesday night New Orleans speech that's become so notorious, the background, who cares at the end of the day, whether it was kind of a sickly green background or not a good background, but that all those sort of things so quickly become a metaphor for the larger discontent with McCain. And I've had people ask me in recent days, this is ridiculous, but this gives you an idea of where some conservatives are. Now, is it really right that the convention has to nominate John McCain? Isn't there someone else? So you still have these kind of absurd fantasies among conservatives, and it's because John McCain is by no means their dream candidate.
And are like Limbaugh and Laura Ingraham and stuff like that, like they've dropped out of the headlines, the fact that they're talking about McCain, but are they still talking about McCain on the air every day and disparaging him and so forth like they were, a couple months ago?
Yeah, well, Laura actually at the moment is not on the radio because of a contract dispute, but Rush is was really pounding on McCain on the energy thing, and actually I think may have played a role in helping turn McCain around on that, because Rush was openly advocating pretty much every day McCain flip-flopping on domestic drilling, and lo and behold he did, and I just don't think Rush is ever going to get particularly excited about John McCain.
Yeah. On Obama and Clinton's voters, I see that as just being a slow, difficult process that's just going to take time, and is going to take people, getting over the sour feelings. I think that 25% number probably stems from, this is my guess, I think it probably stems from the fact that a lot of those people are waiting to see whether he names Hillary as his vice presidential nominee, which of course he's not going to do. I mean, you and I and everybody else who's sort of like us thinks he's not going to do that. So we have to be right. So he's not going to do it, and so then there'll be a period of anger about that. Then we'll get to the period of the convention, and then it will be up to Obama to give both Clintons a good time slot to speak, to make sure that they're not slighted in any way and that they're given their due. Then it will be up to both Clintons to make the case for why Barack Obama needs to be the president, why even though you supported me and us and we love you, you need to go support this man. Then Obama needs to do things to reach out to these people. You know, some people have said, I actually suggested myself in one of my columns, but I've seen since then other people have suggested it. Somebody on the Times op-ed page, I think maybe it was Nick Kristof, said he ought to go give a high-profile speech on gender and sex and sexism of the sort that he gave on race. I think that would be a good, that's something I feel he maybe should have done by now, actually, to start this healing process with Clinton's voters. But he should do something like that at some point. So it's just going to come in stages. It's going to take steps. And then the final step is going to be, of course, I think, explaining, the stakes in federal judgeships and to women who care about the future of Roe v. Wade and how many Supreme Court justices the next president, if he serves for 8 years, is likely to name. If he serves for 8 years, it's probably going to be 1, 2, or arguably 3. And take it from there. And I think that by October, that 25 number is going to be down to negligible to 4. But it's going to take a while.
I'd be very curious to know what the makeup of the 25% is. Or is it predominantly women, or are these white working class voters? Or
yeah, we don't know.
Because you used a formulation a little earlier, kind of struck my ear. You said Hillary is white working class voters, but I don't see those people as really being Hillary voter or having a great deal of loyalty necessarily to Hillary throughout most of the primaries. I imagine they're just kind of parking their vote with Hillary because for whatever reason, they didn't take to Barack Obama. So I saw those people more as anti-Obama voters rather than a Hillary bloc.
Yeah, I think that's right. If I said Hillary's white working class voters, I just was referring to the dynamic of the primary. But I basically agree with you, and I think that as well as she did in West Virginia and Kentucky, if she were the nominee, I think she's going to have a really, really hard time in both West Virginia and Kentucky. Because, I think they were parking the vote with her. It's an anti-Obama vote. A lot of it, let's face it, is a racial vote. McCain's going to win those states. Obama doesn't need to win those states. So they don't really matter in terms of getting to 270. The white working class, I think he can do better with, and to some extent might depend to some extent on his vice presidential pick, who that ends up being, and how much campaigning he can do in those places, and God knows he's going to have how much money, $400 million to spend on this campaign. I mean, I don't know how much he's going to have.
So are you a Jim Webb man?
Well, I do like Webb. There are certain downsides that I see, but with some of the past statements about women. But I think Webb would bring a lot. I think Wes Clark would bring something. I tend to lean toward the people who add credibility on national security and defense and foreign policy. Which some people say, but that just highlights Obama's weakness. I don't really buy that. I think that it's a good match. I think it's reassuring to people. So I tend toward those kind of people, of whom Webb and Wes Clark are two among several possibilities.
On Webb, he makes so much sense on paper because he's the trifecta. He has the national security credentials. He has the demographic, could help demographically, given he's kind of a white nationalist almost, and then he's in a swing state in Virginia, which obviously very important to Obama. But I just worry about how I don't worry about it, but if I were a Democrat, I'd worry about how erratic he is. He's always just struck me as a little bit of a ticking time bomb. And Wes Clark, I think, another one makes sense more on paper than in reality, because I just think in that high pressure environment on a national ticket. Now, Wes Clark's run for something before, but only briefly and not very well.
And pretty damn badly.
For president in 2004.
Yeah, right. Pretty badly too.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I think he's got a lot of pretty good choices before him, and no truly great ones. But I do like Webb. I mean, he's perfect on paper, but I'm sure you read the Jim Fallows comment. Fallows has known him for 30 years and said he's a great guy, but that is the single worst job in the world for him. Now, on the other side, I have kind of an outsider's view on this, obviously, because I'm not plugged into the gossip circuit on your side. I say Rob Portman or Tim Pawlenty on paper make the most sense to me.
Yeah, I think you got a stature gap with both of them. Rob Portman's very impressive. No one knows who he is. Former congressman, former OMB director. He's not going to help you much in Ohio. And while I think it's important for Republicans and for McCain to defend free trade, I'm not sure whether it makes sense having someone on the ticket who's in charge of trade policy necessarily. Pawlenty, I think, he has to be right at the top of the list. Perhaps a potential swing state, a kind of suburban conservatism that's a little different. A younger guy. I just have a little trouble seeing him ready to step in and be president. I think that's a pretty important standard. But the problem, Mike, that Republicans have is exactly the opposite of what you're talking about. Obama has a lot of good choices because there's a really strong bench there, and maybe no one pops out as the perfect choice, but Republicans have a very weak bench, and there are not a lot of good options, which is why I tend to come back to the guy NR endorsed in the primaries, Mitt Romney, because I think he could help a little bit in Michigan. He can talk about economics. He's tireless. He would be, I think, a impeccably loyal and dependable number two for John McCain. But the downside, obviously, the Mormon thing is always a question mark. And two, given current economic conditions, do you really want basically an investment banker who's been involved in various episodes where people lost their jobs on your ticket? But if you don't do him, there's Tom Ridge, who I don't think really helps much in Pennsylvania and it's cause a real problem in the right because he's pro-choice. There's Charlie Crist down in Florida. Conservatives not particularly excited by him. There's the long ball choice of Joe Lieberman. Again, you're going to have a big problem on the right, and I'm not sure how much Lieberman would get him kind of as a Democrat, sort of yesterday's news, given that he's been expelled from the Democratic Party in effect. But if McCain really wants to emphasize that bipartisan, I can work together with the Democrats theme, that'd be the way to go. And just, I'm droning on here, Mike, but one other broader point about the McCain campaign. I think if you listen to a lot of the rhetoric recently, I think it tends towards three things happening with the McCain campaign, and I don't think either of them necessarily will. But one would be a one-term pledge, because he's talked so much about, I'm going to end the permanent campaign, I want to work to fix problems outside of any political considerations, and a one-term pledge would just really put an exclamation point on that theme and emphasis in his candidacy. The other, sort of for the same reason, would be picking Lieberman as his vice president, which I think won't happen. But again, I think the rhetoric and themes tend to take you in that direction. And third, and I think this is the most likely to happen, would be McCain at the end of the campaign, given this tendency in his candidacy, to say, elect me because I'm going to be a reasonable check on the Democrats at the same time I can work together with them because I'm very pragmatic and country means more to me than party. And I think that probably will be a big McCain closing argument.
Yeah, that sounds potentially pretty persuasive, I think. That's, because everybody does know that the Democrats are going to control the House and the Senate. So something like that could work pretty well for him. I can see the sense of Romney. He would tangibly help in Michigan. And if McCain could steal Michigan, then Excuse me. That would make Obama's job a little harder. Well, I'm coughing and stuttering, so shall we say we're done?
Absolutely, Mike. I enjoyed this. My inaugural appearance on Blogging Heads, and I enjoyed sharing it with you.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Mike.
Okay, bye.